The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Overlord, this is Trident 6. We are weapons hot but cannot execute. Repeat, cannot execute. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, leader of SEAL Team 6's Delta Squad, and the strain in his transmission told everyone listening that something had gone catastrophically wrong. In the Tactical Operations Center, buried beneath Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, a dozen pairs of eyes turned toward the massive digital display showing real-time satellite footage of the target compound. What they saw defied every contingency plan, every tactical manual, every piece of conventional wisdom about how these operations were supposed to unfold. The mission had been sold as routine, a high-value target elimination in the Kunar province, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces across the region. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, maybe a handful of fighters, certainly nothing that America's most elite operators couldn't handle with surgical precision. But the thermal imagery now painting the screens told a different story entirely. Where intelligence had predicted 8 to 12 combatants, the compound crawled with nearly 40 heat signatures. Machine gun nests had sprouted from rooftops like deadly flowers. Anti-aircraft positions flanked the main building. This wasn't a hideout, it was a fortress, and it was waiting for them. Trident 6, Overlord, came the calm voice of Colonel Harrison Webb from the operations center. What's your assessment? Morrison's response carried the weight of 15 years of special operations experience. Sir, this is a kill box. Someone leaked our insertion point, our timeline, everything. They're dug in deep and ready for a fight. We count at least 4 RPG teams, multiple crew-served weapons, and what appears to be a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun covering our primary exfil route. If we move in now, we're not coming back. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across continents. In Washington, Pentagon officials leaned forward in their leather chairs. In Tampa, CENTCOM watched with growing unease. The target, code-named Serpent, had been planning something massive, something that could cost American lives on a scale not seen since 9/11. The intelligence was solid, the threat imminent, and the window for action closing rapidly. But the conventional approach had just evaporated like morning mist in the Afghan sun. That's when someone in the back of the operations center spoke up with a voice that carried the distinctive drawl of rural Alabama mixed with the confidence of 1,000 combat hours. Sir, I can get your SEALs out of there. Every head in the room turned toward the source of that voice, and what they saw challenged every preconception about what a combat pilot should look like. Captain Evangeline Reaper Thorne stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her green eyes holding the kind of steady intensity that came from staring death in the face and refusing to blink first. The briefing room had fallen into that particular kind of military silence that preceded either breakthrough or disaster. Thorne stepped forward, her flight suit bearing the distinctive nose art of the 354th Fighter Squadron, a cartoon Grim Reaper riding an A-10 Thunderbolt II, complete with twin 30mm cannons and enough ordnance to level a city block. The patch on her shoulder told another story entirely: 3 Purple Hearts, 2 distinguished flying crosses, and a silver star that she'd earned the hard way over the skis of Syria. But it was the smaller patch beneath them that made some of the younger officers smirk. A bright pink ribbon with the words Princess Squadron embroidered in glittering thread. The backstory behind that patch was legend in certain circles, though few in the room knew the full truth. 3 years earlier, during her first deployment to Afghanistan, a group of Marine helicopter pilots had started calling her squadron the Princess Brigade, a not-so-subtle reference to what they perceived as preferential treatment for female aviators. Instead of getting angry, Thorne had embraced the nickname with characteristic defiance, commissioning custom patches and wearing them with pride. What those Marines hadn't expected was for Princess to become the most feared call sign in theater, synonymous with impossible rescues and enemy formations that simply cease to exist. Colonel Webb studied Thorne with the calculating gaze of a career officer who'd learned to read people like tactical maps. "Captain, the SEALs are 8 kilometers from their target, in hostile territory, with a mechanized Taliban force between them and the compound. Our Predator drones show at least 2 technical vehicles with heavy machine guns, and that's assuming they haven't moved since the last pass. What exactly are you proposing?" Thorne's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that separated true aviators from mere pilots. "Sir, give me 30 minutes and a full load of 30 Mike, and I'll clear a path to that compound wide enough to drive a convoy through." The skepticism in the room was almost tangible. Major Brad Hendricks, the air operations officer, couldn't quite hide his scoff. "Captain, with respect, this isn't a video game. Those thermal signatures show sophisticated defensive positions, coordinated fields of fire, and enough anti-aircraft capability to turn your warthog into scrap metal before you get within 5 clicks of the target." Thorne turned toward him with the patient expression of someone who'd heard variations of this speech more times than she could count. Her voice remained level, professional, almost conversational. "Major, I've been flying the Hog for 8 years. I've put 30mm rounds through windows at treetop level while taking fire from positions that would make your hair curl." She paused, letting her words settle in the room like dust after an explosion. "That compound has stone walls 3 feet thick and metal roofing. My GAU-8 fires depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute. Physics isn't negotiable." The major started to respond, but Webb raised a hand for silence. He'd seen Thorne's after-action reports, had watched gun camera footage that defied explanation, had listened to radio transmissions from ground units, whose voices cracked with emotion as they thanked Princess for pulling their bacon from the fire. The woman standing before him had turned impossible situations into routine Tuesday afternoons so many times that it had become unremarkable. But this was different. This wasn't a danger-close fire mission or a medevac escort through hostile airspace. This was a deliberate assault on a heavily defended position, flying alone into concentrated anti-aircraft fire with the lives of America's most elite warriors hanging in the balance. Webb found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Thorne's squadron commander just 2 weeks earlier. How she'd volunteered for every dangerous mission. How she seemed to court death with a reckless determination that worried even her fellow pilots. Some said she was trying to prove something to a military establishment that still questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. Others whispered that she was running from something, using the adrenaline rush of combat to outrace whatever demons followed her home from the war. The truth, as it often did, lay somewhere in between. Evangeline Thorne had grown up in the shadow of Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, watching F-16 streak across summer skis while her father worked double shifts at the aircraft maintenance facility. Her grandfather had flown P-51 Mustangs over Europe during World War II, and her great-uncle had died in a B-17 over Germany, shot down on his 24th mission. Aviation wasn't just in her blood, it was her blood, flowing through generations of men and women who'd answered their country's call when the stakes were highest. When she'd graduated from the Air Force Academy with a degree in aerospace engineering and a slot in undergraduate pilot training, she'd known exactly which aircraft she wanted to fly. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't the fastest fighter in the inventory, or the most advanced, or the most glamorous. What it was, simply and completely, was the most effective close air support aircraft ever built. Designed around the massive GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, the Warthog was built to destroy enemy armor and provide fire support for troops in contact. Its titanium bathtub could absorb punishment that would drop other aircraft. Its redundant systems could keep flying even with massive damage. and its low-altitude, low-speed capabilities made it perfect for the kind of precise, devastating support that ground forces prayed for when the shooting started. For Thorne, flying the A-10 wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a way to honor the legacy of everyone who'd worn the uniform before her, while proving that courage and skill had nothing to do with gender. Webb made his decision with the kind of calculated risk assessment that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. Captain Thorne, you have authorization for immediate launch. Call sign Reaper 11. You are cleared to provide close air support for Trident 6's extraction and subsequent assault on Objective Serpent. Rules of engagement are weapons free on anything that shoots at you or friendly forces. Time on station as required, fuel permitting. Thorne snapped a crisp salute, her face betraying nothing of the adrenaline surge that always preceded combat. Roger that, sir. Reaper 11 launching in 15 minutes. As she turned toward the door, Webb called after her. Captain, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Bring them home, he said simply, and she nodded once before disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. The flight line at Bagram buzzed with controlled chaos as Thorne conducted her pre-flight inspection under the harsh glare of sodium lights. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, had been working on her aircraft since before midnight, ensuring every system was perfect, every round of ammunition properly loaded, every flight control surface functioning within tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Rodriguez had been turning wrenches on A-10s for 12 years, had seen pilots come and go, had worked with some of the best aviators in the Air Force. But he'd never worked with anyone like Thorne, someone who treated her aircraft not just as a machine, but as a partner, who knew every rivet and wire and hydraulic line with intimate familiarity. She's ready to go hunting, ma'am, Rodriguez reported as Thorne completed her walk-around inspection. It looked like what it was, a weapon of war designed by engineers who understood that form should always follow function. Her aircraft, tail number 80221, bore the scars of 8 years of combat operations. Patches where shrapnel had been repaired, paint worn away by countless hours in the Afghan sun, and the distinctive black exhaust stains that marked a warthog that had seen serious action. But beneath the weathered exterior lay 65,000 pounds of perfectly maintained death machine, capable of delivering precision firepower with surgical accuracy or area devastation, depending on the tactical situation. Thorne climbed into the cockpit with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through startup procedures she could perform blindfolded. The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines spooled up with a distinctive whine that every infantryman in Afghanistan knew meant salvation was on the way. Her heads-up display illuminated with targeting symbology. Her multifunction displays showed green across the board, and her radio crackled with the familiar voices of Bagram Tower Control. Reaper 11 Bagram Tower, you are cleared for takeoff runway 09, winds 070 at 8 knots, altimeter 3002. Thorne's response was crisp, professional. Bagram Tower, Reaper 11 rolling. They accelerated down the runway with deliberate purpose rather than explosive speed, its twin engines providing the steady, reliable thrust that had made the aircraft legendary for its ability to operate from rough, forward airstrips under impossible conditions. As the landing gear folded into their wells and Afghanistan fell away beneath her, Thorne felt the familiar sensation of leaving the complications of ground life behind and entering the three-dimensional world where she was most truly herself. At 30,000 feet, the war looked abstract, almost peaceful, just brown mountains and valleys stretching toward horizons that seemed to promise infinite possibility. But Thorne was heading down, not up, toward the kind of low-altitude hell where aircraft died and pilots became statistics. Her radio came alive with Morrison's voice, tight with controlled tension. Reaper 11, Trident 6. We are currently holding position at grid 42 SMD 1247-5831, approximately 8 clicks southwest of Objective Serpent. Enemy activity includes at least 3 technical vehicles with mounted weapons, multiple fighting positions on elevated ground, and what appears to be coordinated movement suggesting they're preparing for our approach. Can you provide immediate close air support to clear our route? Thorne's response carried the kind of calm confidence that ground forces had learned to associate with imminent enemy destruction. Trident 6, Reaper 1-1. I have you on my scope, currently inbound your position, ETA 4 minutes. I'm carrying a full combat load including cluster munitions and enough 30 mic to redecorate the landscape. What do you need me to paint? Morrison's tactical assessment came through with battlefield clarity. Reaper, we have 3 primary threats. 2 technical vehicles positioned at grid 42 SMD 1251-5834 and 1248-5829, both mounting what looks like DSHK heavy machine guns. Third technical is mobile, last seen moving between positions at the northern edge of the compound. Additionally, we count at least 6 fighting positions on the ridgeline to our east, and thermal imagery suggests they've got RPGs and possibly a recoilless rifle. Thorne absorbed the information while her eyes swept across her tactical displays, building a 3-dimensional picture of the battlefield in her mind. The target area appeared on her moving map display as a cluster of buildings surrounded by rough terrain, perfect defensive ground for anyone with the sense to use it properly. Copy all, Trident 6. I'm going to make 3 passes. First pass will be east to west, engaging the mobile technical and northern fighting positions with gun runs and cluster munitions. Second pass north to south, targeting the 2 stationary technicals with precision strikes. Third pass will be a show of force along the ridgeline to suppress any remaining resistance and clear your approach route. Morrison's acknowledgement carried the relief of a professional soldier who'd just been handed a tactical advantage. Roger that, Reaper. We'll mark our position with infrared strobes and stay heads down during your runs. You are cleared hot on anything that's not us. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan rose around Thorne's A-10 like ancient monuments to human conflict, their peaks carved by millennia of wind and war into shapes that seemed almost deliberately defensive. At 20,000 feet, the morning sun painted them in shades of gold and shadow that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Thorne wasn't sightseeing, she was hunting, and her prey was waiting in the valley below with enough firepower to turn her aircraft into aluminum confetti if she made a single mistake. She pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar sensation of controlled falling as her altitude indicator began spinning counterclockwise, trading safety for position in the eternal calculus of combat aviation. At 15,000 feet, she could make out the compound through her targeting pod, a collection of mud brick buildings that looked deceptively peaceful in the early morning light. Her infrared sensors painted a different picture, the heat signatures of at least 40 fighters moving between positions with the kind of coordination that suggested professional military training rather than ragtag insurgents. Intelligence had been wrong about more than just the numbers. This wasn't a hideout, it was a trap, and the SEALs had walked straight into it. The first technical vehicle appeared in her crosshairs at 12,000 feet, exactly where Morrison had said it would be. Through her magnified optics, Thorne could see the distinctive profile of a Toyota pickup truck with a Soviet-era DSHK heavy machine gun mounted in the bed, its long barrel tracking across the valley floor as the gunner searched for targets. The weapon could punch through light armor at distances up to 2 kilometers, making it a serious threat to helicopters or low-flying aircraft. But the DSHK had one significant disadvantage when facing an A-10 Thunderbolt II. It fired bullets, while Thorne was about to deliver 30mm depleted uranium rounds at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. She rolled inverted and pulled her nose toward the earth, feeling the familiar pressure of gravity trying to push her consciousness into the black corners of G-force unconsciousness. The world outside her canopy rotated 90 degrees as she transitioned from level flight to a screaming dive attack, the kind of high-angle approach that maximized her weapon's effectiveness while minimizing her exposure to enemy fire. Her targeting computer calculated intercept angles and projectile trajectories with mechanical precision, but it was Thorne's human intuition that read the subtle movements of the technical vehicle and predicted where it would be when her rounds arrived. At 8,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger, and the GAU-8 Avenger cannon came alive with a sound like God tearing canvas. The recoil from the massive weapon actually slowed her aircraft's forward progress, 3,900 rounds of depleted uranium screaming earthward at nearly a mile per second. The first burst walked across the valley floor like deadly rain, kicking up geysers of dirt and rock before finding its target. The technical vehicle simply disintegrated, not exploded, not destroyed, but erased from existence as if it had never been there at all. Thorne pulled out of her dive at 3,000 feet, her aircraft straining under forces that would have crushed a less robust airframe. The valley floor fell away beneath her as she climbed back to altitude, already acquiring her second target through the targeting pod. But something was wrong. Her radar warning receiver was painting contacts, lots of them, coming from directions that shouldn't have been possible. Reaper 1-1, Trident 6, be advised we are taking effective fire from positions not previously identified. Recommend you abort current attack and reassess. Morrison's voice carried a new edge, the kind of tension that came from watching tracers streak past your position while counting rounds and wondering when your luck would run out. Thorne didn't abort. Instead, she did something that would be analyzed and debated in Air Force tactical schools for years to come. She descended to 500 feet above ground level, well below the effective altitude for most anti-aircraft weapons, but squarely in the engagement envelope of every rifle and machine gun in the valley. At that altitude, she could see everything with perfect clarity: enemy fighters running between positions, muzzle flashes from weapons that had been invisible from higher altitudes, and the complex defensive network that intelligence had completely missed. More importantly, at 500 feet, her 30mm cannon became a precision instrument capable of placing individual rounds through windows with surgical accuracy. The second technical vehicle died as spectacularly as the first, its fuel tank erupting in a fireball that painted the morning sky orange and black. But Thorne's low-altitude approach had revealed the true scope of the enemy force, and what she saw made her blood run cold. This wasn't just a Taliban stronghold. It was a sophisticated military position, complete with interconnected fighting positions, overlapping fields of fire, and defensive preparations that spoke of months of planning and significant outside assistance. Someone had turned this remote valley into a killing ground specifically designed to destroy American forces, and they'd almost succeeded. Her radio exploded with chatter as she pulled up from her second gun run, multiple voices talking over each other in the controlled chaos of a firefight gone wrong. Reaper, Trident 6, we are taking heavy fire from the compound, multiple RPG impacts near our position. Overlord, Trident 6, requesting immediate extraction. This target is beyond our current capability. All stations, this is Overlord. We have multiple aircraft inbound. ETA 12 minutes. But 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. In combat, eternity was measured in heartbeats, and the SEALs were running out of both time and options. Thorne made a decision that would define the rest of her career and haunt her dreams for years to come. Instead of climbing to a safe altitude and waiting for reinforcements, she pointed her A-10's nose at the compound and pushed the throttles forward. Trident 6, Reaper 1-1, I'm going in alone. Mark your position and stay down. Morrison's response crackled with disbelief. Negative, Reaper, that compound is too hot for a single aircraft. Wait for backup. But Thorne was already committed to her attack profile, descending toward the valley floor at a steep angle that would either save the SEALs or add her name to the list of pilots who'd pushed their luck one mission too far. At 2,000 feet, the anti-aircraft fire began in earnest. Tracers streaked past her canopy like deadly fireworks, and her radar warning receiver screamed warnings about missile locks and targeting radars. A lesser pilot might have broken off the attack, might have climbed back to altitude and waited for a safer opportunity. But Thorne had learned long ago that safety was an illusion in combat. The only real security came from eliminating threats before they could eliminate you. She pressed her attack, flying straight into the teeth of the enemy's defensive fire, with the kind of calculated aggression that separated heroes from footnotes in military history. The compound grew larger in her windscreen with each passing second, its details becoming clearer as she closed the distance between hunter and prey. She could see individual fighters running between buildings, could track the muzzle flashes from automatic weapons as they tried to bring her down, could even make out the frantic gestures of commanders trying to coordinate their defense against an attack they hadn't expected. The Taliban had prepared for helicopters, for conventional ground assault, for artillery bombardment. They had not prepared for a single A-10 Thunderbolt II flown by a pilot who'd learned to thread the needle between courage and insanity. Her first pass shattered the compound's northern wall with a sustained burst from the GAU-8, 30mm rounds punching through stone and steel with contemptuous ease. Secondary explosions bloomed as her depleted uranium penetrators found ammunition storage areas and fuel supplies, adding the enemy's own ordnance to her destructive potential. But it was the psychological effect that proved most devastating. The sudden, overwhelming realization that their carefully prepared defenses were utterly inadequate against the kind of firepower screaming toward them at 300 miles per hour. Thorne pulled up from her gun run and immediately rolled into a steep left turn, her aircraft groaning under G-forces that would have incapacitated civilian pilots. Through her mirrors, she could see smoke billowing from multiple points within the compound, evidence of successful hits against high-value targets. But her tactical displays showed the battle was far from over. Enemy fighters were repositioning, trying to concentrate their fire against her next approach vector, and her fuel gauge reminded her that even the most successful attack meant nothing if she couldn't make it home to rearm and refuel. Trident 6, Reaper 1-1, how copy? Morrison's response came immediately, his voice tight with the controlled adrenaline of a soldier who just watched death incarnate sweep past his position at eye level. Reaper, Trident 6, that was beautiful work. You've neutralized approximately 70% of the defensive positions on the northern approach. We are moving to assault the compound now, ETA to target 8 minutes. Can you provide overwatch during our approach? Thorne checked her ammunition counter, still plenty of 30mm rounds remaining, plus 2 cluster bomb units and a full load of high-explosive rockets. Roger that, Trident 6. I'll be your guardian angel. Nothing gets close to you without going through me first. What followed would later be described in after-action reports as a textbook example of close air support coordination. But the dry language of official documentation could never capture the true artistry of what transpired in that Afghan valley. Thorne orchestrated the attack like a conductor leading a deadly symphony, her A-10 dancing between mountain peaks and valley floors, while delivering precisely targeted destruction to any position that threatened the advancing SEALs. When enemy fighters tried to flank Morrison's team from the east, 30mm rounds arrived with mathematical precision. When an RPG team attempted to set up on a rooftop overlooking the assault route, cluster munitions transformed their position into empty air and settling dust. The SEALs moved through the valley like ghosts, using the cover and concealment provided by Thorne's devastating fire support to advance on their objective with minimal resistance. Every time they encountered a defensive position, every time enemy fire threatened to pin them down, Reaper 1-1 appeared overhead with the kind of close air support that ground combat troops spent their entire careers hopping to experience. Morrison found himself watching the sky as much as his front, marveling at the way Thorne seemed to anticipate threats before they fully developed, the way her aircraft appeared exactly where it needed to be with split-second timing that defied explanation. But it was during the final assault on the compound itself that Thorne truly earned her place in military legend. As the SEALs breached the outer walls and began clearing buildings room by room, they discovered that objective serpent, the high-value target they'd come to eliminate, wasn't just a Taliban commander. He was a former Pakistani ISI officer who'd been coordinating attacks across multiple provinces, and his compound contained intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations throughout the region. More critically, he was attempting to escape through a tunnel system that intelligence had never identified, emerging from a hidden exit nearly a kilometer from the main compound. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio with urgent intensity. "Reaper 1-1, we have Serpent squirting north from the compound, moving in a white pickup truck with 2 escort vehicles, heading toward Grid 42 SMD 1255-5841. This is our primary target. We cannot let him escape." Thorne's response was immediate. "I have visual on 3 vehicles moving north, engaging now." But as she rolled in for her attack, her radar warning receiver exploded with new contacts. The enemy had been saving their ace in the hole, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile system that they'd kept hidden until the most critical moment. The SA-7 Grail missile streaked upward from a concealed position, its infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of Thorne's engines. Lesser pilots might have panicked, might have broken off their attack to deal with the incoming threat. Instead, Thorne did something that violated every principle of defensive flying. She continued her attack run while simultaneously deploying countermeasures, trusting her aircraft's defensive systems and her own flying skills to defeat the missile while keeping her weapons on target. The SA-7 lost lock as her flares bloomed like deadly flowers across the morning sky, but her concentration never wavered from the fleeing vehicles below. Her guns spoke once more, and the escort vehicles simply ceased to exist, transformed from threats to memories in the space between one heartbeat and the next. But the white pickup truck carrying Objective Serpent was still moving, still threatening to escape with intelligence that could cost American lives for months to come. Thorne had one shot, one opportunity to end the mission successfully, but it would require the kind of precision flying that existed at the very edge of human capability. She dove toward the valley floor, pulling out of her attack run so low that her engines kicked up dust clouds from the desert floor, and lined up for a gun run that would either end the threat or end her career in a fireball visible from orbit. The GAU-8 cannon erupted one final time, its distinctive sound echoing off the valley walls like thunder from an angry god. Depleted uranium rounds stitched across the desert in a perfectly straight line, each projectile guided by computer-assisted targeting, but aimed by human intuition honed through thousands of hours of combat experience. The white pickup truck disintegrated in a cloud of dust and smoke, taking with it not just Objective Serpent but months of planning for attacks that would never materialize, intelligence networks that would never be activated, and American casualties that would never occur. Morrison's voice carried a note of awe that he couldn't quite suppress. "Reaper 1-1, Trident 6, target neutralized. I say again, Serpent is down, target destroyed. Outstanding work." But Thorne's response was characteristically understated. "Trident 6, just doing my job. Do you require further close air support or are you ready for extraction?" The professional calm in her voice belied the adrenaline still coursing through her system, the hyper-alert state that followed successful combat engagement, the mixture of relief and exhaustion that came from dancing with death and walking away intact. As the SEALs completed their mission and moved to their extraction point, Thorne climbed back to altitude and began the lonely flight home to Bagram. The valley below looked peaceful again, just brown earth and scattered rocks with no evidence of the violence that had erupted there moments before. But she knew that somewhere in the Pentagon, analysts were already reviewing gun camera footage and satellite imagery, trying to understand how a single, had accomplished what an entire special operations team couldn't? The answer, she reflected as Afghanistan's mountains rolled past beneath her wings, had less to do with superior technology or overwhelming firepower than it did with something far more elemental: the willingness to fly into harm's way when others were depending on you, regardless of the personal cost. Her landing at Bagram came as the sun was painting the Hindu Kush mountains in shades of pink and gold, transforming the harsh landscape of war into something almost beautiful. As her aircraft touched down on the familiar runway, Thorne felt the subtle shift that always marked the transition from combat back to the mundane world of debriefings and maintenance schedules, and the thousand small details that kept a military operation functioning. But she also felt something else, a growing awareness that this mission had been different, that something fundamental had changed in the way people looked at her, talked about her, thought about what she was capable of accomplishing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting by her parking spot as she shut down the engines, his weathered face split by a grin that threatened to divide his head in half. "Ma'am, I just got word from the ops center. They're calling it the most successful single-aircraft close air support mission in the entire Afghanistan theater. 37 confirmed enemy KIA, complete destruction of the defensive network, and 0 friendly casualties. That's going in the history books." Thorne climbed down from her cockpit with the careful movements of someone who'd been flying for 5 hours straight, her flight suit soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline aftershock. "Rodriguez, it was a team effort. You keep my bird flying, I keep pulling triggers. That's how it's supposed to work." But even as she said the words, Thorne knew that something had shifted in the fundamental balance of her military career. Word of the mission would spread through official channels and unofficial networks with equal speed, carrying her call sign and her story to every corner of the American military establishment. By evening, pilot bars from Nevada to North Carolina would be buzzing with talk of the female A-10 driver who'd taken on an entire Taliban stronghold and emerged victorious. By morning, her achievement would be the subject of briefings at the Pentagon and analysis at the Air Force Weapons School. By the end of the week, her name would be spoken in the same breath as legends like Chuck Yeager and Robin Olds and John Boyd. The debriefing session that followed was unlike anything Thorne had experienced in 8 years of military service. Instead of the routine questions about fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure that typically followed combat missions, she found herself facing a room full of colonels and generals who wanted to understand exactly how she'd accomplished the impossible. Colonel Webb led the session with the kind of detailed tactical analysis usually reserved for major battles, breaking down each phase of the attack and examining the decisions that had turned a potential disaster into an overwhelming victory. "Captain Thorne," Webb began, his voice carrying the formal tone of official recognition, "your actions today prevented what could have been a significant loss of American Special Operations personnel, while successfully eliminating a high-value target that intelligence services had been tracking for over 6 months. Your tactical employment of the A-10's capabilities in a high-threat environment demonstrates the kind of innovation and courage that exemplifies the finest traditions of American military aviation." The words were carefully chosen, appropriate for the official record, but they carried an undercurrent of genuine admiration that everyone in the room could hear. Thorne's response was characteristically direct. "Sir, I had superior situational awareness courtesy of Trident 6's ground reconnaissance, excellent intelligence support from the operations center, and an aircraft designed specifically for this type of mission. The A-10 performed exactly as advertised, and the enemy made tactical mistakes that any competent pilot could have exploited." Her attempt to deflect praise was admirable but futile. Everyone present had watched the gun camera footage, had seen the way she'd threaded her aircraft through enemy fire with the precision of a surgeon and the aggression of a warrior. General Patricia Voss, the two-star commander of coalition air operations in Afghanistan, leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that suggested career-defining conversations were about to occur. "Captain, I've been flying fighters for 22 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished today." The tactical situation was completely compromised. The enemy was prepared and well-positioned, and conventional wisdom would have suggested waiting for additional assets before engaging. "What made you decide to press the attack?" Thorne considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would be studied and analyzed by military professionals for years to come. "Ma'am, the enemy was counting on our predictability. They'd prepared for a conventional response, multiple aircraft, coordinated attacks, adherence to standard tactical doctrine. By going in alone and at low altitude, I presented them with a tactical problem they hadn't trained to solve. Sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is an elegant application of simple principles, superior firepower, delivered precisely, when and where the enemy least expects it." The general nodded slowly, recognizing in Thorne's words the kind of tactical insight that couldn't be taught in classrooms or learned from textbooks. The ripple effects of the mission began almost immediately. Within hours, Thorne found herself fielding congratulatory calls from pilots she'd never met, squadron commanders who wanted to understand her techniques, and even a brief conversation with the Secretary of the Air Force himself. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. She joined the military to serve her country, not to become a celebrity, and the sudden spotlight felt more like a burden than a reward. What bothered her most wasn't the praise itself, but the underlying assumption that her success was somehow surprising, as if competence in combat was unexpected from someone who happened to be female. The media attention started 3 days later, when a Pentagon spokesman mentioned the successful rescue mission during a routine press briefing. Within hours, reporters were calling the story "The Angel of Afghanistan," describing how a lone female pilot had saved an entire special operations team through superior skill and courage. Thorne watched the coverage with growing unease, recognizing that the narrative was being shaped by people who'd never flown combat missions, never felt the weight of responsibility that came from holding other people's lives in your hands, never understood that gender was irrelevant when measured against competence and dedication. But there was one voice that cut through the noise with startling clarity. During a telephone interview with Aviation Week, retired Air Force Colonel Martha McSally, herself a pioneering female fighter pilot, offered an assessment that resonated far beyond the military aviation community. What Captain Thorne accomplished wasn't remarkable because she's a woman. It was remarkable